Hey everyone, Riot has been saying all year that they're taking a look at mages and trying to increase their satisfaction, and in the upcoming patch 13.10 we have a couple changes to Rabadon's and Lost Chapter, but I don't really think they fix any of the core issues that mages currently face. In this video, I'm going to try and explain what I think about mages currently and how I would go about fixing them. So mages are not necessarily weak. I think they are strong and competitive, and while they are relatively average in solo queue, they are also at best a little frustrating and at worst pretty damn unfun currently. Not all mages are the same either. Within the mage class, you have a huge variety. You've got burst mages like LeBlanc, Zoe, and Vex, utility mids, something like Ahri or Lissandra, more traditional mages like Syndra, Victor, Orianna, DPS mages like Cassiopeia and Swain. You could even break it down further and say, artillery mages, Ysera, Ziggs, Lux, support mages like Karma, etc. Point being, there are a lot of different types. So whenever we're discussing mage changes, you have to bear in mind that some of these champs are actually in pretty good states in solo queue, like LeBlanc, Ahri, or Cassiopeia. But some of these champs are a lot worse off. So what is the big difference between solo queue and competitive for mages? For me, I think there are three differences that are particularly relevant. First is just how fed people get. In solo queue, it's really not uncommon to have someone on the opposing team with 8, 9, or maybe even 10 kills, and the game isn't really balanced around this. Some champs are just really hard to play against when they get that fed unless you have certain defensive items. In competitive, people naturally don't get as fed as they do in solo queue, and so it's much easier to play in a mobile champion and defensive items aren't as required, which will be very important for when we talk about itemization. The second is damage balance. In competitive, you and your teammates will draft together and hopefully make some sort of cohesive comp. If you do have a mage on your team, most likely they will be your solo AP threat, which makes it far less likely for the enemy team to itemize lots of magic resist. As a result, you won't need a Void Staff as early as you might when you're playing multiple AP threats in solo queue. This again will be really important when we talk about itemization. If you do play multiple APs in competitive, they might be more utility champions, so they aren't really relying on building full damage anyway, examples again being Lissandra or Ahri. So once again, Void Staff isn't as required. And lastly is the pace of the game. Competitive moves a bit slower, there is an increased emphasis on the laning phase since it goes for longer and priority is more important. There are also far fewer random skirmishes, which benefits mages as they tend to be pretty strong in the isolated laning phase, and because there are less kills, the majority of your gold will come from CS instead, which, once again, benefits mages as they are very good at wave clearing and farming. While solo queue still does reward farming, you can get a lot more gold from kills and skirmishing in solo queue than you can in competitive. Knowing the differences then between solo queue and competitive, what are the biggest problems facing mages in solo queue? As I kind of hinted at before, I think itemization is probably the biggest one. So let's take a look at what your kind of typical mage build looks like. It's probably going to look something like this. You go a mythic, let's say Ludens, you grab your tier 2 boots. From then on, you grab a second item of your choice. Let's just say it's a Shadow Flame, could be a Cosmic or something like that. After that, you will grab Rabadons. By this point, you probably do need a Void Staff, and for your last item, you can go something situational, most likely a Zhonya's or something like that. Now, this build is actually fine, and I would say that this is overall a pretty fine state for mages to be in if you can build something like this. It's perhaps a little low on the AP side, I think 638 total is a bit low. Obviously, I don't have, so you can see my runes here, I wouldn't have Gathering Storm stacked up in this situation. I don't have Eyeball. I'd be missing other buffs from being higher level, in this case, Syndra passive. So there's a lot of other modifiers that could make this higher, but overall, I don't really have a big problem with this build. The big problem comes in when you're forced to kind of deviate from this very standard mage build. Our first deviation that doesn't really feel too good is what if you need to buy a defensive item early? So when you're buying defensive items on mages, you can only ever really buy them as your second item or your last item, and I'll show you why. So pay attention to my AP throughout this. If you go for a defensive item third, so let's say we go something like Shadow Flame and then we go Zhonya's. The problem is this delays Rabadons by such a long time, and you have so little AP at 3 items that even if you currently play the game without having the Zhonya's, you're probably better off dying and getting all your cooldowns off by just having more AP. So if this, for example, if this Zhonya's in this case were a Rabadon, so we go from 288 to 443, and this is not even considering the fact that you might have other multipliers, it's just such a DPS loss to go a defensive item anything after the second item because you're just delaying Rabadons and Void too much. Rabadons and Void, Rabadons especially, is just too important. So you can go at second, you can go Zhonya second, and then look to go for a Rabadon's third, and that's not too bad. Like, obviously you have less damage as a result, but it's not too bad, and I think that's like the best way to go a defensive item if you do need one. Worth noting though is that, again, at the second item spike, there is a pretty big difference. Like, if you have a Shadow Flame, like Luden's Shadow Flame compared to Luden's Zhonya's, like the Luden Shadow Flame does a lot more damage, and that is actually pretty important because in solo queue, if you can get like more kills and snowball further, then it's easier to keep getting items, right? But a lot of the time, if you go something like Luden Zhonya's, you can actually get stuck on those items for a pretty long time, especially if you are building a defensive item like Rabadon's. And so you might instead go for something a little cheaper. You know, maybe if you did go for something like the Shadow Flame, but the problem is, again, you just have so little damage. So you can kind of see already that if we are forced into buying a defensive item early, you basically can only ever buy it second. Like, you really don't have a choice. And if you do buy it third, you deal no damage. And even when you buy it second, it's such a significant DPS loss that it often feels like it's not really viable to buy a defensive item. Like, you're really only buying it because you literally can't play the game without it, rather than like it's good for the game itself. And I think the reason that feels like more problematic on mages compared to other champs is it feels like it's not a choice that some of the other classes make. Like, you often see some of the like bruisers, for example, going something like Sunderer, Cleaver, and then they can build like whatever they want after that. Like, they basically have all the damage they need at those two items and then can just itemize whatever they want. It's kind of the same with tanks, where once again, they kind of get pretty much like their tank items and can itemize purely situationally, like don't need to worry about building towards specific items. Even 80 carries now, obviously it's like a bit different, but 80 carries get their core on 2 items as well. They can go you go Mythic and then IE or Navori, and you've got all the damage. And while you can't build defensive items, so to speak, after that, you can still build somewhat situationally. Whereas it feels like for mages, you're not reaching your core until like 3 items, maybe even 4 if you include a Rabadon's. So it's much harder to build situationally. Another deviation from the standard build that can happen is if the enemy team buys a lot of magic resist in the early game, you're probably forced to go for a Void Staff. And this is very, very common if you're playing multiple AP champs on a team, as we kind of talked about before, because magic resist items are very strong and they're very accessible. You can get Merc Treads and Hex Drinker really, really easily. So what are your options when you come up against a lot of magic resist? Well, you can kind of continue with your normal build. So let's say that you went for a second item, something like a Shadow Flame or something like that. You can go for a Void third, and you should go for a Void third, but it still feels very bad because you end up again with such a small amount of AP, and it delays your Rabadons all the way to 4th item. And a lot of solo queue games don't even go all the way to 4 items. So like, these are going to be your 3 core items for the game, and you're going to be sitting less than 300 AP for the majority of it. Now, your other option is if you realize that they're going to build MR really early, because either you've got lots of AP on your team or they're already showing MR items, you can look to go for a Void Staff second into a Rabadon's third. Once again, at 2 items, you have like a fair amount of damage in terms of pen, but again, in raw AP, you don't have a whole lot. And while you can go Rabadon's third, which gets you up to a nice amount of AP, the problem with this again is that you essentially are just full damage. Like, you have no ability haste other than like what your Mythic and runes are providing you. You have no form of other defensive or HP. Like, in order to do damage, you've had to itemize full glass cannon, which again, I think feels bad because I don't think that's a decision that other classes really make. To be clear on that, I think that while there should be a difference between, naturally something that builds full damage should deal more than someone who builds like defensive items. Like, I'm not saying that by building Zhonya's, you should be doing the same damage. What I am saying is that the difference between building a defensive item and building full damage is too large. I think you almost don't deal damage if you build defensive items, and you only deal damage by building damage items. And it feels like a lot of the other classes can build, tankier, like something like Sunderer Cleaver, and still do very competitive damage. And I guess to kind of summarize, like, both of these situations of either buying a defensive item second or buying a Void Staff second, they don't occur as often in competitive because, like I said before, typically you're playing a solo AP threat, so you don't really need the Void Staff, or the enemy team just isn't as fed, or you've got like peeling tools and stuff, so you don't need those defensive items as much as you do in solo queue. One question you might have is, why can't you go Rabadon second? And the answer is that you can sometimes, but it's just you can't all the time. So the thing with buying Rabadon second is that it's somewhat reliant on having extra AP from other sources. So an example being like if you have a Dark Seal or a Medjai's, if you have Stacked Eyeball Collection, if you have Absolute Focus Gathering Storm, some other way to kind of make it more efficient, you can go for Rabbit on second. It's also pretty awkward to kind of build towards this. Like, it's very expensive, and just basing with a full 1250 gold on every base is quite difficult. So while you can go for Rabbit on second, it's kind of reliant on being at least a little ahead in the game so that you can consistently, itemize towards these, and that you do have AP from other sources, whether that's, from your runes, again, kind of like a full AP setup here, or from having, a fully stacked Magi's or something. Maybe I'll show some examples of games where I have done that. So the answer is, like, you can sometimes, and then you could go something like a Zhonya's third, or you could go something like a Void Staff third, but it's just more difficult to go Rabbit on second than other items. What then are our solutions to these issues? I think you could fix defensive itemization and open up room for more situational items in a couple different ways. You could just remove Rabadons completely and spread out the power to all the other items. So, for example, making Shadow Flame or something like 130 or 140 AP. It possibly comes with the issue of individual AP items maybe being too strong. I think there are solutions to that too, though. Like, you could have some sort of set bonus effect where Shadow Flame, for example, is worth 100 AP when you buy it, but once you have like 2 AP items, that gives you 120. Once you have 3, it gives you 140, or some sort of something like that. Just something to make it so you have more AP without having Rabadons. Overall, I think some sort of change like that would make defensive items not so painful to buy and broaden the amount of items that are actually available to you. Alternatively, if you didn't want to remove Rabadons and spread the power out, you could just make Rabadons a really strong second item, like how IE and Navori work as like a linchpin of the crypt builds. It might make itemization a little boring, but it would provide a really consistent path to making sure mages have consistent access to damage and can then build situationally from there. To fix the MR stacking or Void Staff problem, there's several solutions. You could just buff Void Staff a lot by increasing the AP, which I think is more of a band-aid solution, but it would probably work. I'd like to see something like splitting Void into several different items, maybe 2 or 3. I think you can make one for burst mages that kind of just need to kill a squishy that has MR, maybe one for kind of like the mages that need to deal with the tanks that have a lot of HP and MR, something that maybe shreds magic resist, like percent-wise or something like that. The alternative approach is just to nerf magic resist, which seems to be the approach Riot's taking in 13.10. Personally, I think it's better to reduce the accessibility of MR as opposed to actually reducing the values, because I think that if someone buys MR, you don't want it to feel like buying MR is actually useless, right? Like, it just doesn't do anything. I think more the issue is just how much sort of like ambient MR is in the game. Like, for example, people will buy like a Merc Treads or a Hex Drinker, and you don't really need to invest like a lot into that, but you still have enough MR that it sort of warrants going a Void Staff. So I think maybe hitting that sort of accessibility, maybe making it so Mercs are just bought for the tenacity as opposed to the magic resist, which they kind of already are, but the fact they give 25 MR on top of it is really annoying. And making Hex Drinker like not as strong a component or something, I think that would be better than outright nerfing. I guess like Force of Nature, like they're nerfing in 13.10, does need a change, but I think the accessibility should be more the target as opposed to the raw MR value. A smaller problem I have with mages is the laning phase. So as I said before, in competitive, 1v1 laning tends to be more important, and most traditional mages are quite good at the isolated 1v1 lane, but they don't want to skirmish too much. In the current meta, early game is really important. However, it's more about early skirmishing and priority usage as opposed to 1v1 laning. In competitive, skirmishing is still of course important, but it's often decided by who gets priority over the lane, which is determined by obviously laning strength, both of the player and the champion, but you also have to factor in junglers, gank setups, supports, vision, etc. At the moment, in both competitive and in solo queue, you can get away with playing some of the weaker laning champions or neutralizers like Lissandra or Ahri because you can't put them far enough behind to stop them from just playing for the 2v2 or playing towards other lanes. Riot seem to be looking at this with the upcoming minion changes, which I think should make laning a bit more important since roaming seems like it's not as easy. Honestly though, not a huge fan of the change because I think it will make the game a bit more boring overall, but I do like the thought of trying to promote the 1v1 action a bit more. For me, the biggest problem with laning and holding back the 1v1 is actually teleport, because teleport just makes the laning phase far too forgiving. When you think about it, teleport gives you a second health bar and it amplifies any existing sustain you have. For example, like corrupting pot, you can just buy corrupting, you go back, you get a second health bar and you refill all your corrupting pots. Even with the sustained nerfs, you can make a lot of mistakes in the laning phase and still be fine just because of the sheer amount of health that you have, and even if you do die, a lot of the time your first death is not too bad because again, you can base TP and get back to the wave. TP also reduces the snowball potential for both players in a kind of prisoner's dilemma concept. Essentially, mid laners would prefer to take a combat summoner like Ghost, Ignite, or Exhaust, but you kind of can't because playing into someone with TP if you don't have TP almost guarantees you lose lane. As a result, both mid laners are forced to go TP, and it means it's much harder to kill one another, and you both have so much extra HP that you just can't really poke each other out. You can sometimes get away with combat sums in solo queue because people don't know what they're doing, but that's the main reason why every mid and competitive has to take TP. So what are some possible solutions to that? I've thought about this quite a bit actually. I think one solution is to make it so you just can't use teleport before 6 minutes. It would mean that if you do get chunked out or lose really hard early on, that first base would be much more punishing. Alternatively, I think removing TP as a sum completely and making it into an item that people can buy come mid game as like a boot enchantment or something could be really interesting. Both would require some champs to be rebalanced, of course. Like a champ like Akali wouldn't be able to lane mid without TP. I think it is easier to rebalance champs though with health regen and sustain in the early game without having to worry about balancing also for their second health bar. It would be a pretty big undertaking, honestly, but I think it would make the game much more exciting if mid and top laners were able to take combat sums like Ignite again, and you'd probably see a lot more action in the laning phase and competitive as well. With that all being said, and in conclusion, I am not a game designer, and while I've proposed some solutions, I'm sure there are problems with these, and Riot could probably do better than me. To reiterate, I think the biggest problems with mages at the moment are the itemization feels like it lacks choice and is too reliant on Rabadons. I think buying void and defensive items is often necessary, but feels like it really destroys your damage output. Finally, I think the laning phase is far too forgiving in the 1v1, and I think that's something that makes the game not as fun to play or to watch, and it hurts mages as well. If you guys have any solutions to these problems, feel free to share them in the comments, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys think.